Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, Brian Laundrie is still a fugitive. How has Brian managed to outsmart the FBI? Well, that is the focus of today's episode. Brian Laundrie was last seen 10 days ago, last Tuesday. That was September 14th. How has he managed to evade the full might of the law, the laser focus of the media and social media? Well, I think it's time for some true crime rocket science, wouldn't you say? In order to track and predict a person's movements, you've got to know who they are and how they think. You also want to predicate it to some extent on past behavior, previous patterns, previous movements, and then ask some general questions. Are they conservative or are they risk takers? Are they sporty or nerdy? Are they outdoorsy or indoorsy? Are they Bear Grylls level badasses or a mama's boy? The main reason I believe Brian has been one step ahead in the manhunt is because the FBI and law enforcement still have no idea who they're dealing with. So let's use what we know to predict where Brian is and where he isn't.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
So before we get started on today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the 300 or so of you who have subscribed since the last episode. And let's get started. So the first point, and I've made 7 separate points. The first one is, when Brian was on the run before, what did he do? Where did he go? So if Gabby died on the afternoon of August 27th, then Brian hung around for at least 2 days after that before driving back to Florida. And he drove back to Florida, I think, on August 30th, arriving there on the 1st of September. Now, in a real sense, Brian was actually on the run, I think, immediately after August 27th. What did he do then? Well, he appeared to establish his alibi with at least 2 hitchhikers and also left a digital trail using Gabby's phone, possibly, and then that trail seemed to be leading towards Yosemite. So he was calm enough to stay in the area and muddy the trail, right? Potentially. And then after leaving behind smoke and mirrors, perhaps he moved swiftly in Gabby's vehicle back home. I think that's the other point to emphasize, is that he didn't go off on his own steam, using his own resources. He relied on something that belonged to somebody else, in this case, Gabby's vehicle. Bear in mind, he's a 23-year-old without a job, without an income, right, without a home of his own. And then, of course, he repeated the same thing at home in Florida. He spent around 10 days at home, and a few more days after everyone figured Gabby was missing, he was sort of in that area. It feels like he worked on some misdirection, both with his parents and by leaving the Mustang and a note behind, doesn't it? Suggesting, implying what he was about to do and where he was about to go, just as had been done with Gabby via the no service in Yosemite scam, right? So you might think Brian could have and would have gone on the run directly into the wilderness in Wyoming, right? But he didn't. Instead, what did he do? He returned from the wilderness. And that's quite important, is to bear in mind the context leading up to this. Brian has been in the wilderness for, a month and a half, almost 2 full months. Do you think he really wants to go back to it? And you might think that he would, but you're not Brian. And you've got to put yourself in Brian's shoes. Things were actually getting unpleasant in the van, and is that something he wants to go back to? That brings us to point number 2. He's used misdirection before, hasn't he? And this is how misdirection works in true crime. You don't look where the smoke and mirrors stuff is. You don't look in the direction of the misdirection. You look away from it. If the fabric is pointing you in a direction, you look in another direction. So, for example, the last text referring to Yosemite, no service in Yosemite, that indicates that's where you don't want to look, right? You don't look there. And what was the result in this case? Well, Gabby wasn't in Yosemite. She wasn't anywhere near it. And so we need to apply the same psychology here. In terms of the search, Brian uses a vehicle, a note, and the location of the vehicle and note to suggest he's somewhere in the very hard to search Colton Reserve, which is quite close to the the home of Brian Laundrie on Wabasso Avenue, right, in Florida. And that brings us to the third point. Is Brian sporty or nerdy? And bear in mind, if you're going to talk about the Fugitive in the Harrison Ford version of the word, right, then you think of someone who's on the run, who is doing a triathlon across several states and, swimming across rivers and running marathons across the landscape, right? It's a very physical, sporty sort of thing. Well, it's also physically exhausting. It can be expensive. You're going to need to eat often. It's something like running an ultra marathon. And actually, your chances of being seen in a situation like that are a lot better than if you just stay at home and watch TV all day. So if you think that Brian is more sporty, then he's more likely to be outdoors. That would be more natural for him. If nerdy, it's more likely that he'd be indoors. As far as I'm concerned, Brian's most basic idiosyncrasy is that he's a graphic designer, is an artist. He draws a lot. Most of his Facebook and Pinterest is about his art and his interest in design. Even his Instagram profile identifies itself not through his name, as Gabby's does, but as bizarre designs. That's how he sees himself. Graphic designers spend a lot of time in one place, thinking, detailing in their drawing and their conceptions, playing with minutiae, but they are essentially sedentary and indoors, right? Brian's not an athletic type, although the footage that we see at the Great Sand Dunes does show he's capable of being athletic when he wants to be. But does he gravitate to that? Is that his baseline? I would say no, it's not his baseline. It's not what he wants to be doing. It's not what he has been doing. This kind of thing is the exception, right? Now you might think, I'm not quite sure if I agree with that. Well, let's check that. And that brings us to the fourth point, the Moab incident as a parallel story. Now, in the events at the Spread Creek Dispersed Camp in Wyoming, we see that there's a single episode here in Brian's programming, and his recent escape on September 14th is another single episode. And so you want to put those episodes side by side and find corresponding patterns. We could also argue that the Moab incident is a third episode, and so it's almost like putting three cards side by side on the table and looking at what patterns of behavior, what psychology runs through all three of them. And so if we take the Moab incident, what is going on? Well, Brian's driving a vehicle, an incident happens, he's separated, and then at the end of all of this, what happens? He spends the night in a hotel. He could have elected to spend it anywhere. He could have gone camping or spent it inside the vehicle. He could have insisted that Gabby be allowed to stay in the hotel and that he would stay in the vehicle. Instead, he toes the line and he stays in the hotel while his traumatized girlfriend spends the night alone in her van. I also want you to consider the overarching narrative here. Brian never completed the journey he signed up for. He went home not once, twice. Once by flying home and the next by driving home. Both times returning home, right? Both times he returns home from the wilderness. And when he went home, he didn't leave Gabby camping somewhere. Gabby stayed at a hotel in Salt Lake City. Why are they in hotels in the middle of their summer epic? Why are there incidents taking place in urban settings, such as a grocery store and a restaurant, rather than at campsites? Because they're visiting urban settings quite regularly, quite frequently. Why are they eating in restaurants? Well, because they're not quite as wild and outdoorsy as they'd like us to believe. They're not quite as out there in the wilderness as their Instagram suggests, right? That brings us to point number 5. So where is he? Where is Brian Laundrie? So just basically, is he indoors or outdoors? Is he in the wilderness or in the suburbs? The kayak canoe footage, was that a mistake or a misdirection? Now, we know Brian has been selectively deleting information, which means even during the search for him, it feels as though he's maintained some kind of access to digital communications, something that's not easy to do in the wilderness. You need access to a device, you need a power source, and you need either Wi-Fi or some kind of connection to mobile data. On the other hand, we know he's left his cell phone and wallet behind. But what about his computer? I do know that they seized a hard drive from the inside of the van. Now, what else we know is that he spent July and most of August camping and evidently didn't enjoy it. Things were escalating, they were arguing. If they did enjoy it, they would still be out there right now. And it seems like they didn't enjoy it, and one of my mods, Gene, has come up with a really good Dutch proverb that sort of illustrates it. Love makes a small bed wide, right? And I think what that suggests is the discomfort in a small space, and that even within a small space, it can feel like you are far apart from somebody else. Number 6, what is Brian doing, and is there a risk he might harm himself? Well, besides keeping tabs on what's being said about him in the mainstream media, Brian is probably looking at the numbers on his social media with interest and satisfaction. Their project, Nomadic Static, has got 104,000 subscribers, and the one and only video they put up, Van Life, Beginning Our Van Life Journey, has got over 5 million views in around about a month. But now, what can he do with that? Gabby's no longer around, and that is the problem. And so in the same way that he's been setting up smoke and mirrors, he's also been deleting some digital breadcrumbs, such as people he's been following, etc. I don't think there's a risk of him harming himself simply because he's invested so much effort in trying to cover up and escape. Also, during the Moab incident, if Brian was overwhelmed or emotionally compromised, you wouldn't see him smiling and appearing as relaxed as he apparently does. Brian is driven by anger, resentment, and perhaps paranoia. He's not depressed, but he may be haunted by the loss of Gabby, especially given how their social media is exploding right now. At the moment, he appears more driven than he does tormented or troubled. This is his chance to stick a finger into the eye of the world and show how much smarter he is. And that brings us to the 7th and final point. He's staying with a relative. That's the true crime rocket science theory. In his former life, before he became a fugitive, this is where Brian lived. This is what he's used to. Do you see pictures of the great outdoors, cowboy hats, fishing trophies, moccasins, ice axes, or crampons? Well, instead you see the regular trappings of the modern youth, popular box office franchises such as Batman and Star Wars, and that is what he's paying homage to. Brian's folks have enabled him for around 5 years since he left school. He's used to the easy pass, and he got some of that in the 2 weeks that followed his departure from Wyoming. If his folks covered for him in the beginning, is a relative helping him out, directly or indirectly, somewhere else? So, to conclude, as much as the FBI thinks Brian thinks he's Bear Grylls, he's actually the boy next door, and that's where you'll find him. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.